A cold night. Under the sickly glow of a street lamp, a ragged man sat huddled on the curb. His suit was crumpled, his face smeared with dirt, his eyes vacant as if his mind had slipped away. Strangers passed by without a glance, but a homeless black woman stopped. She reached into a plastic bag, pulled out a stale loaf of bread, tore it in half, and handed him a piece. No one could have guessed that this trembling figure in the shadows carried an identity that would shake the entire world. The night wind slipped through the damp cracks of the alley. The ragged man clutched half a loaf of bread in his trembling hands, chewing each crumb like someone who had just escaped death. Beside him, the black woman quietly pulled an old blanket over his shoulders. Her name was Maya. Years ago, she had a home, a small family. But the economic collapse took everything away. It took her husband. It took her job. It took her roof. Now the sidewalk and a rusty awning were all she had left. Richard, that was the man's name, lifted his eyes to her. They were vacant, bewildered. He could not even remember his own name, nor where he had come from. Only a heavy emptiness pressed down on his mind. Maya laid her calloused hand gently on his shoulder and said softly, "Do not be afraid. I am here." The next morning, Richard woke as the first rays of sunlight broke through. He saw Maya dividing a bowl of thin soup she had received from a charity kitchen. The smoky broth was bland, but he ate as if it were the finest meal of his life. A man who once wore tailored suits and sat in grand boardrooms was now learning how to hold a plastic spoon while sitting on the curb. Days passed. Richard followed Maya wherever she went. She taught him how to gather empty cans to sell at a recycling depot, how to clutch a piece of cardboard tightly to use as a bed when night fell. Sometimes he fumbled and dropped the bag of bottles. Maya laughed softly and told him, "It is all right. Just pick them up again." Richard bent down, collecting each scattered can, his hands shaking like a child learning to work for the first time. Passers-by threw looks of disdain. Some even spat cruel words. These people just leech off society. Richard lowered his head, fists tightening. Deep inside, shame gnawed at him. But Maya remained calm, breaking a stale cookie in half and handing him a piece. At least we still know how to share what little we have. That is enough. One stormy night, they huddled beneath the rusty awning. Rain lashed in. Icy cold. Richard shivered uncontrollably, but Maya pulled him close and draped their only blanket over both of them. He froze in disbelief. The poorest woman he had ever met was also the only one who refused to abandon him. The contrast was brutal. This man who once signed billion-dollar contracts now sat hunched in the rain, chewing stale bread, surviving only because of a homeless woman's kindness. Suddenly, a sharp pain flashed through Richard's head. Fleeting fragments surfaced, bright stage lights, the roar of applause, a skyscraper towering overhead. Then, just as quickly, they vanished like the chill wind. He clutched his skull, gasping for breath. Maya only squeezed his shoulder tighter and whispered, "Do not force yourself to remember. What matters is that you are still alive." In those first days, Richard trailed behind Maya like a shadow. He still had no idea who he was. All he knew was that she was the only lifeline he had left. His world was reduced to alleys that reeked of garbage, long lines outside charity kitchens, and the torn blanket Maya spread beneath a leaking awning. One morning, as the two of them stood in line for food, a group of other homeless men approached. They were larger, their eyes hard. One of them snarled, "This is our spot. Go beg somewhere else." Richard stumbled backward, bewildered. Maya stepped in front of him, her thin shoulders squared. "We are hungry too, just like you. No one has the right to drive anyone away." The man sneered. He snatched the loaf of bread from Richard's hands, crushed it, and tossed it to the ground. Richard stared in shock as the crumbs scattered across the wet pavement. A surge of anger welled up inside him, but his feet felt nailed to the ground. Maya crouched down, calmly picking up every scrap and slipping them into her plastic bag. She said nothing, only tugged Richard away with her. That night, beneath the dripping awning, she quietly gave him half of the watery porridge she had saved. They can take the food, but they cannot take our dignity. Richard sat still, his hands trembling. Strange images flickered in his mind. A vast boardroom, men and women in expensive suits, fists pounding the table. He clutched his head, struggling to hold on to memories that slid away like water. Maya placed her hand on his shoulder and said gently, "Do not push yourself. I am here." The next day, Richard decided to help Maya collect bottles and cans. He followed her, learning how to dig through trash, how to bundle plastic bottles. He was clumsy. The bag split and bottles clattered across the street. A group of children burst out laughing. One of them shouted, "Beggar." Richard's face burned with shame. He dropped to his knees, gathering the bottles one by one. His hands grew filthy, sweat mixing with dust and grime. For the first time in his life, he felt utterly low. But when he looked up, he met Maya's gaze. She was smiling, holding out an empty bottle to him. That smile eased the sting inside his chest. That night, the two of them leaned against a stained wall. Maya spoke of her past, a small home, a family, everything swept away by the collapse. "I once thought my life was over," she said softly. "But then I realized life can still go on, as long as we know how to share." Richard listened in silence. A tide of emotion rose in him. Impossible to name. He still could not remember who he was, but as he listened to her voice, a new feeling stirred within him. Something unfamiliar, yet comforting. A fragile sense of warmth. Winter nights cut like knives, and rain slashed the pavement as if trying to tear it apart. Richard curled beneath the awning with Maya. His breathing grew shallow, his body trembling. His whole frame seemed ready to collapse. Maya reached out in alarm, pressing her rough hand against his forehead. It burned with fever. Richard was sick. In his delirium, he muttered broken words, eyes rolling restlessly. Maya searched her bag, finding only a few coins. Without hesitation, she slipped off the worn ring from her finger. It was the last memento of her late husband. She held it tightly for a moment, then dashed into the rain, heading to a pawn shop. She traded the ring for a handful of crumpled bills, just enough for medicine and a bowl of hot porridge. For days, Maya stayed at Richard's side. She cooled his forehead with a damp cloth, fed him spoonfuls of thin porridge. At night, she held him close, shielding him with her frail body. The rain hammered outside, but inside that corner of the awning, there was still warmth, kept alive by a woman who had never let go of kindness. Eventually, Richard opened his eyes. He saw Maya slumped beside him, fast asleep, still clutching the damp cloth in her hand. His heart jolted. He could not remember who he was, but he knew one thing with certainty. Without her, he would have died. One night, rain pattered on the metal roof above as they leaned against the wall. Maya sighed. "I once dreamed of a little house, just enough for a fire so winter would not be so frightening. But then it all vanished." Richard stayed quiet for a long while, then whispered, "I once had an entire castle, but I never felt I had a real home." Maya turned to him in surprise. He gave a faint smile. "Maybe we are both just searching for a place to belong." In the days that followed, Richard tried to help Maya more. He learned how to stack bottles, gather scraps of paper, and sell them to the recycling depot. He was clumsy but determined. With each day, their bond grew stronger. They did not just share food and shelter. They shared silence, stray conversations, and the fragile comfort of each other's presence. One afternoon, as they ate soup at the charity kitchen, Richard overheard two men whispering. "The billionaire has been missing for so long. Maybe he is already dead." Another replied, "Rumor says it was an accident. Some even claim he was silenced." Richard froze. A stabbing pain split his head. Images flared, blinding lights, a wine glass, heated arguments. He groaned, clutching his skull. Maya quickly steadied him, whispering, "It is all right. Do not force your memory. Just live day by day." Outside, the rumors of a missing billionaire spread through the city. But Richard remained nothing more than a ragged man huddled on the sidewalk, clinging to the care of a homeless woman. No one knew that this quiet survival was the beginning of a story that would change the world. The morning sky was unusually clear after a night of heavy rain. Richard and Maya pushed their rickety cart along the street. One of the wheels stuck at an angle, screeching with each turn like a weary sigh. They passed shops just opening for the day. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from a small cafe, making Richard's stomach growl. Maya smiled faintly. "Just a few more bottles and cans," she said, "and we will have enough for a proper breakfast." Richard nodded and quickened his pace, as if convincing himself that life, no matter how harsh, still left room for hope. They stopped in front of a cafe with a small television mounted above the door. The morning news was playing. A familiar face flashed across the screen. Richard froze. The man on the television wore a sharp suit, stepping out of a limousine, shaking hands with officials. Beneath the image, a headline scrolled. "Real estate billionaire Richard Montgomery disappears mysteriously. No news for 2 weeks." The name struck him like a hammer. His head throbbed violently. He staggered. Clutching the rusty railing for balance, Maya rushed to steady him, pressing a half-empty bottle of water into his hands. Richard reached toward the screen through the glass, his eyes wide. Shattered fragments of memory rushed back, flashing cameras, a grand hall, thunderous applause, the screech of brakes, a violent crash, darkness. He gasped, drenched in sweat, the images slipping away too fast to hold. "Are you all right?" Maya asked in a low, anxious voice. Richard stared at her, dazed, and whispered, I know that man. That is me." Maya gripped his shoulders firmly to keep him from collapsing. "Do not force yourself. Whoever you are, to me, you are still the man who shared half a loaf of bread with me. Remembering or not remembering does not matter. What matters is that you are alive." But from that moment on, Richard could no longer find peace. Every time he closed his eyes, fragments of memory clawed their way back. A gleaming office, signed checks, towers of glass scraping the sky. He often woke in the middle of the night, breathless, haunted by a single question. Who am I really? The next day, Richard followed a pull he could not explain. At a wide intersection, he stopped, staring at the two roads stretching ahead. His pulse quickened, urging him to turn left. Maya frowned. There is nothing that way. But Richard insisted. "Let me try. My heart races for a reason." Maya said nothing, only walked beside him. They crossed a parking lot, walked past a row of tall buildings. Then Richard stopped short. Before him stood a towering glass skyscraper, its sign gleaming under the sun. Montgomery Real Estate Group. His mouth fell open. It was like looking into a mirror. His legs trembled. In a broken whisper, he said, "This is where I belong." Maya laid her hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently as if to anchor him in the present. But Richard no longer doubted. The buried memories began to fit together. Who he was, why he had vanished, and that the entire world was still searching for him. Maya turned to him and spoke softly. "If this is true, then you can go back. But whether you are a billionaire or just a man curled under a leaking roof, you are the same to me. Someone who needs to be loved, Richard's throat tightened. He looked at her, this weathered woman with clear eyes, and realized something. She was the anchor that had kept him from sinking into despair. Without her, he would have frozen to death long ago. As they walked away from the skyscraper, Richard glanced back one last time. He knew he could not keep running. His true identity was laid bare. Yet a different fear gnawed at him. If he returned to the blinding world of power and wealth, would he lose the one person who had saved him in the shadows? Late in the afternoon, the sun cast a harsh red glow across the tall buildings, stretching their shadows endlessly over the street. Richard stood at the foot of the Montgomery Real Estate Group headquarters, staring at the glass panels that reflected the sky like countless shards of a giant mirror. Each reflection showed him something different. Sometimes a ragged vagrant, sometimes a proud man in a suit. Maya stood beside him in silence. Her hands tightened on the handle of their cart, as if she feared that once he walked through those doors, they would forever belong to two different worlds. A sudden surge of memory struck Richard like lightning. A blazing boardroom, the whisper of an aide in his ear, the scent of expensive wine, a contract laid out across a polished table, then a dark car pulling away from the tower, sheets of rain pouring down, headlights cutting through the night, the violent crash that hurled him into nothingness. He pressed his temples, swaying on his feet. A security guard approached, frowning at his shabby appearance. "Who are you here to see?" the guard asked cautiously. Richard opened his mouth, but his throat was dry. He pointed at the silver logo gleaming above the entrance and said faintly, "I am Montgomery." The words cracked the air like thunder at dusk. The guard smirked, shaking his head. "Move along. Do not cause trouble." Maya reached to pull him away, but Richard wrenched free. He stumbled to the reception desk, snatched a pen and a sheet of paper. His handwriting shook but remained firm. Richard Montgomery. The receptionist glanced down, then froze. Her face hardened. She immediately picked up the phone. Within minutes, a man in a dark blue suit hurried out. His eyes widened at the sight of Richard. "My God, we thought you were dead." The words sliced through the fog in Richard's mind. Memories rushed back in a torrent. He remembered who he was. He remembered the faces in the boardroom smiling coldly as he left that night. He remembered the laughter behind his back. He remembered the sting of being abandoned. Richard collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Hot tears spilled onto the gleaming wood of the table. He had returned. But for what? To sit again on a lonely throne, surrounded by people who had only wished him gone, or to reclaim the man he had become, a man who knew hunger, who knew cold, who had felt the mercy of a stranger's hand. Maya stood quietly nearby, the air heavy between them. Fear crept into her chest. He would step back into the glittering world and leave her in the shadows where she had always belonged. But suddenly Richard rose. He grasped Maya's hand, pulling her to his side. He looked straight into the eyes of everyone gaping around them. "This is the woman who saved my life. Without her, none of you would see me standing here." His voice rang out, steady and strong like a bronze bell. The hall fell into silence. A heartbeat later, dozens of cameras flashed. Reporters had already swarmed the building, snapping furiously at the scene unfolding before them. The missing billionaire returned after 2 weeks, standing hand in hand with a homeless woman. Richard lifted Maya's hand high for all to see. "I owe her my entire life, and I will never let go." The words thundered through the grand lobby, tearing apart the suffocating silence. The crowd gasped in shock. Maya trembled, unable to believe what she had heard. And Richard, for the first time since his fall into darkness, felt truly alive. The news of Richard Montgomery's return spread like a storm across the media. Online outlets, television channels, and social networks all blazed with the same image. A bearded billionaire in torn clothes holding the hand of a homeless black woman in the middle of his company's lobby. Some admired, others mocked. The following day, Richard called a press conference. The hall was packed with journalists, cameras, and blinding flashes. He sat at the main table, with Maya quietly beside him, her eyes uncertain before hundreds of lenses. Richard's voice was hoarse but firm. For the past 2 weeks, I had nothing. No name, no fortune, no memory. I survived only because of a woman this society refuses to see. He turned, clasping Maya's hand. She saved me. And now, I want the world to know she is not invisible. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A reporter jumped to his feet. Are you officially acknowledging this relationship? A billionaire and a homeless woman? Richard stared directly into the cameras. Yes, I will never deny the hand that saved my life. The hall erupted, the answer hitting like a bomb. But the shock wasn't over. The doors swung open, and a tall man strode in, immaculate in his suit, his gaze cold. It was David, the vice president of the company, the man who had quietly seized power during Richard's disappearance. He offered a thin smile. Apologies for arriving late. But I have a few matters to clarify. He held up a thick folder of documents, his voice sharp and deliberate. These are the financial records. While Richard was missing, I kept this company running smoothly. But tell me, does a man who was found wandering the streets, clinging to a homeless woman, still deserve to lead this empire? Gasps filled the room. The words cut like knives, striking not only at Richard, but at Maya, shaming her before the world. Flashbulbs popped. Reporters hurled questions. Maya lowered her head, her shoulders trembling. Richard slammed his hand on the table. Enough! His voice boomed. He rose to his feet, pulling Maya beside him. If you believe a corporation is built on numbers and schemes, then you are wrong. It is built on trust. And the only person who trusted me when I had nothing was her. David chuckled, preparing to counter. But a female voice rang out from the back of the room. I have proof! All eyes turned to a former assistant of Richard's. She stepped forward, holding a USB drive, her voice shaking but resolute. I stayed silent because David threatened me. But I cannot stay silent any longer. Here are emails and recordings that prove he deliberately concealed the truth. The atmosphere exploded. Reporters surged forward, cameras rolling. David's face drained of color. He lunged for the USB, but security pinned him back. The hall descended into chaos. Richard tightened his grip on Maya's hand, his eyes blazing. For the first time since his ordeal began, he was reclaiming not just his memory, but also the faith of those who still stood by him. The second twist struck like a hammer blow. The traitor exposed in front of hundreds of cameras, while Richard and Maya stood tall together in the storm of the media. The press hall erupted like a bomb. Shouts echoed, cameras flashed in rapid fire. Reporters hurled questions one after another. David struggled and shouted his denials, but the USB had already been connected to the giant screen behind him. Rows of incriminating emails and spreadsheets appeared, undeniable evidence. Among them was an audio recording of his own voice ordering his assistant, "Keep Montgomery's accident quiet. Let the public believe he is on vacation." "I will assume control." The audience roared. Shareholders in the front rows turned pale, exchanging grim looks, nodding as if the picture had finally become clear. One journalist shouted, "David, do you deny this is your voice?" David screamed. "Fake, all of it is fake." But his voice trembled, his eyes darted frantically, sweat pouring down his face. Richard stepped onto the podium, pulling Maya with him. He did not need many words. Just standing there, hand in hand with her, was enough for the image to burn itself into every lens in the room. His voice rang out clear and resonant. "Here is the truth. When I lost everything, none of you came to find me. Not one shareholder walked the streets to look for me. The only person who reached out her hand was a homeless woman." He tightened his grip on Maya's hand, his eyes sharp as blades. "And now, I choose to stand with her, no matter what you think." The hall fell into stunned silence for several seconds. Then the cameras roared again, the flashes more intense than ever. Maya stood beside him, cheeks flushed, tears shimmering in her eyes. She had never imagined she would one day stand in a place of light, not as someone despised, but as someone whose hand was held openly before the world. David erupted, his voice cracking with rage. "I have lived my whole life in his shadow. I worked day and night, but every triumph bore the name Richard Montgomery. And you think I am unworthy? I am the one who should lead this company." His voice broke between envy and despair, his face red with fury. An elderly shareholder rose, his face burning with anger. "No, David. You chose betrayal. That alone makes you unworthy. You betrayed the company. You betrayed all of us." Security surged forward, pinning David as he tried to lunge for the USB. Cameras followed, capturing every second as he thrashed and shouted, his face contorted. The spectacle was broadcast live across every major network. All of America watched a powerful man unravel, his greed and cowardice exposed to the world. After the press conference, the public exploded with debate. Some mocked Richard for openly standing beside a homeless woman. Others praised it as proof of compassion, the transformation of a man who had once lived only at the peak of power. The more voices of support emerged, the faster the story spread. The tale of the loaf of bread and the billionaire swept through social media, becoming a symbol of kindness, retelling the moment when Maya shared half a loaf with Richard in the street. Inside the company, the board of directors wasted no time. A vote was held. David was stripped of all authority. He now faced the possibility of trial for abuse of power and covering up the truth. Richard was reinstated, but he stood before them and declared that he would step back for a time to learn how to be human again. His words silenced the room. Then, slowly, the applause rose, filling the air. In the days that followed, Maya moved with Richard into his vast mansion. The press swarmed, snapping photos of every detail. They captured him stepping out of a limousine with her, walking with her, through gardens blooming with white roses, pouring her a cup of hot tea with careful hands. Some laughed with scorn, but many more wept at the sight. A billionaire who had lost everything now cherished every small moment beside the woman the world had once forgotten. One evening, Richard stood before the press again. He did not deliver a speech on business. His words were simple. "I will marry her." The hall froze. Then chaos erupted. Flashes exploded like fireworks. Reporters shouted over one another. Maya stood in shock, her eyes blurred with tears. She had once thought she would live the rest of her life beneath a leaking roof. But now, another door had opened before her. Not because of wealth, but because her kindness had been returned with love. Meanwhile, in a temporary detention cell, David watched the broadcast on a small television. He screamed and pounded against the bars, but no one heard him anymore. Outside, the world spoke of only one name, Richard Montgomery, and the love story that brought the world to tears. On the wedding day, the sky was a clear blue, as if washed clean after a long storm. There were no extravagant fireworks, no powerful dignitaries in attendance. Only a simple garden, 2 rows of white chairs, and a few hundred people who had once witnessed Richard and Maya standing hand in hand in the storm of the media. Maya walked across the grass in a plain white dress that hugged her thin frame with quiet grace. Richard waited at the end of the path, his eyes never leaving her. When their hands finally touched, the crowd broke into tears. Cameras captured the image of a billionaire who had once lost everything, now finding happiness, with a woman who had once slept beneath a leaking roof. In his short speech, Richard said, "Money can vanish. Memory can fade. But kindness never disappears. It was kindness that saved me and gave me the chance to love once more." Thunderous applause filled the garden. Maya lifted her head high, her eyes shining. She was no longer a homeless woman. She had become a symbol of the strength of compassion, and the message echoed in every heart. Love and kindness can cross any boundary of wealth, power, or color. If one day you were left with only a single loaf of bread, would you have the courage to share it? Because sometimes one small act can change the course of another person's life.